Hey everyone, we're going to get started in just about 3 minutes, so if you want to grab a drink and grab a seat, we'll get started in about 3 minutes. There's plenty of room on the floor up front if people want to sit on the floor. There's plenty of room in the back if people want to stand over there.
If I did that this time, people might think I was making a commentary on internal DFA politics. Which would be...
So do you want to sit next to me? I'm going to go What was the... kind of primary interpreters and disciples. I can mention that.
It makes me feel like
it's like, I mean, I think in large part, no one is really committed to that stuff methodologically. It's almost for protection as within the human system, all these other probably not very find excuses like, you know what. Yeah, I'm teaching 2 undergrad classes. And this week I'll be teaching sustainability in the master's program. Dr. You take that? Yeah, so I had my first classes last night. And how do you feel? Good, weird, or like? What are the other students like? There's one white guy who said he was in the training. He worked with Rick Wolf, but I guess he didn't.
Good evening. Hi, good evening. How's everyone doing? Good. So thanks everyone for coming out. It's just an enormous turnout. We expect that there'll be more people coming in. So if there's space near you and you want to indicate that to people as they're coming through the door, we'd love to make space on the floor, in the back, anywhere we can. I'm sure it's no coincidence that the attendance in this event sort of took a sharp uptick as the events in Texas were unfolding. And of course, there was no way we could have known this was going to happen. We were planning an issue on climate change. And, it's a unfortunate coincidence that makes it, all the more relevant. Because of what's happening in Texas, we made 2 changes to the event tonight that I just wanted to let people know about at the outset. One, we're asking people to donate to the Hurricane Harvey Community Relief Fund. They specialize in serving impoverished people and undocumented immigrants. These are the people who are least likely to receive support in Texas. So we want to make sure that we support that organization. We're going to circulate a box or a hat. Does someone have a box in the back that they can circulate? So we'll get that circulated through the crowd. If people could give cash money, if they can, we're going to donate that to the relief fund. If people are watching at home, hello. There's a link in the description for this event that you can follow to donate as well. The other change is that we invited Kate Aronoff to join us. Kate contributed to the issue, so it makes total sense that she'd be here, but she also covers, as a writing fellow for In These Times, she covers the politics of climate change, the Trump administration, et cetera. So it's actually really great to have her here, to have everyone else here. I'll introduce the speakers individually as we open the conversation. Can you hear me now? Okay, great. So I'll introduce the speakers as we get deeper into the conversation. But just to say something a little about the issue, we're here to celebrate the launch of issue number 26, Earth, Wind, and Fire of Jacobin magazine, which is taking up climate change. We didn't know, obviously, that what was going to happen in Texas would happen, 6-7 months ago when we started planning this issue. But we did know something that's been very clear for a very long time, which is that capitalism is killing the planet. That is an idea that is increasingly common sense on the left. It's actually increasingly common sense in the environmental movement. But one of the gaps out there that I've sort of experienced is that a lot of the literature coming out in books or articles or speeches sort of really drives home the capitalism is killing the planet theme, which is an important argument to be making, and we should all be making this right now. But in addition to that, there's a sense of like the problems that are so big. What do we do about this? What can we do? So what we wanted to do with this issue is put forward some, not just some analysis of the climate crisis that we face, and there's excellent, about half the issue is dedicated to that. but also to talk about what are some strategies for merging ecological concerns with working class movements. Alyssa edited the issue, did a fantastic job. This is one of the issues I'm most proud of since I've been here. We're really excited to have it here. I hope people can grab it on their way out. We're going to discuss with four of the contributors to that issue now. Just wanted to say a few quick thanks. Thanks to Verso, of course, for hosting this beautiful space. They open up to us all the time. There's just a ton of people, and it's hard to get in a space this nice for it's nice to have comrades here at Verso. Thanks to the speakers for agreeing to be here. Some agreed very recently because we were putting this together on short notice. The contributors, really, I can't say enough about how solid the issue is from top to bottom, and we had several dozen people contribute to the issue. Wanted to thank all of them, and thank everybody for coming out here. What we're going to do is we're going to have a discussion amongst the contributors about different aspects of climate change and strategies for socialists and for working class movements going forward. And then we're going to open it up to a discussion because we really want to get as many people involved as possible. Because that's a little complicated to broadcast, we're going to let the people at home go at that point, and then we'll turn it over for a discussion here, and then we'll have a good back and forth with the speakers. So with that, I'll just ask a few questions to each of the speakers and then sort of give them a chance to engage with one another. So, Kate Aronoff, as I said, wrote for the issue. She's also a writing fellow for In These Times. Wrote a terrific climate change article the other day, Climate Change and the Deportation Machine. And I think you have something coming out at The Intercept today or tomorrow, right, on the massive scam that is flood insurance. People should check those articles out. The thing that I sort of wanted to ask you about at the outset is the damage in Texas is already being compared to Katrina, right? That's like a commonplace comparison. And after Katrina, when there was total chaos in the region, there was all kinds of rounds of privatization. Other political schemes were just pushed through in the chaos, right? This is the quintessential example of Naomi Klein's shock doctrine. And so, in many ways, Republicans control politics at most levels in Texas. They seem primed to do a lot of the same stuff. So I'm wondering, what are the areas that we should be watching out for? And, are we going to see a replay of Katrina, not just in terms of the damage, but in terms of the sort of privatizations and things they're able to push through? And what should we be looking for?
Yeah, I mean, to that question, I hope not. And I think part of that is because, we do have this example of Katrina and kind of what happened after that. And a lot of that reporting came out, I think I was pretty young at the time, but I think a lot of that sort of came to light a little bit afterwards. And to the credit of journalists who were there on the ground when it happened. And on the ground when it happened. But I think in thinking about kind of what the impact of Harvey is likely to be, one thing to look out for, obviously, is just the way we're starting to talk about this. So, there's different levels of kind of depoliticization going on in this conversation. So you've seen not just sort of Fox News, but also CNN, MSNBC, trying sort of actively to depoliticize this around the issue of climate change specifically. So, it's too soon to sort of talk about issues of climate change. It's too soon to make this about politics. It's already in many ways about politics, and Naomi Klein just sort of wrote a piece about that today. But I think it also presents a kind of different and sort of specific challenge to those of us on the left and thinking about, and people who believe in climate change and are already sort of tuned into this issue, to look at this is actually what climate impacts will look like. So a lot of you probably read that David Wallace Wells piece, sort of massive, a pretty impressive piece of journalism in some ways, but it also kind of paints this picture of climate impacts as happening in some far-off future. So it kind of assumes all else is equal, right? It's, society is structured in essentially the way it is today. Things are getting hotter, oceans are getting acidified, shorelines are rising, all of these sort of horrible things are playing out. But what that really doesn't get at is that, there are politics here. Climate impacts don't happen in some sort of vacuum where capitalism and racism don't exist. And so we're seeing that play out in Texas, and I think, that is happening in sort of myriad ways. The two big ones that I've been paying a little bit of attention to is that there have been communities of color fighting refineries in their communities in Houston for years and years and years, have higher rates of cancer, air quality is worse, water quality is worse. So that's been sort of ongoing, and you're seeing these kind of horrifying things play out right now, where these refineries are releasing extra emissions that they wouldn't otherwise, and that obviously hits people who are in proximity to those communities and maybe did not have the means to leave and get out of Houston before the storm hit. So that is like one of the kind of ways that this is extra horrifying, and that a hurricane by itself would not be. If there were no people there, we wouldn't really care. Hurricanes hit places where there aren't people all the time, and we don't really hear much about them. What's horrifying is that they do hit where people are, and those people are organized in very particular ways because of very particular reasons. Most of that rooting in some way back to either racism or capitalism, and the ways that they're tied, and a number of other factors. And you saw this with immigration. Texas is on Friday, I think, set to implement this kind of horrifying "Show Me Your Papers" law called SB4 that's been that people have been fighting for several months, which is kind of like SB 1070, if folks are familiar with that, which got defeated several years ago. It makes it legal for cops to ask for people's immigration status at routine things like traffic stops. It makes it a felony. It holds police, like individual police officers, criminally liable if they refuse to sort of comply with federal immigration orders. So it's a crackdown on sanctuary cities. So that's really the context where Harvey's playing out. It's you have all of these things going on at once, and nothing stops when a hurricane happens. And as we've seen with Katrina, we've seen with Sandy in some ways, a lot of those things come out in full force, actually, like in the aftermath of the storm. So in Texas especially, it seems to be what are these refiners going to do? How are they going to actually try and protect in some way, shape, or form the people who live in those communities and mitigate the harm around them, and what's going to happen to these folks who might be affected by SB4 and obviously there are other things, but yeah.
Are there? I mean, it's a tough situation because even before this was happening, you watched the Abbott signing bills that say communities can be held liable and penalized in all kinds of ways if they act as sanctuary cities. It seems like the cards were lined up in advance. In some way, it just felt like things were so bad and dramatic, and they were putting guns on campus. There was just one thing after the next, where it's hard to imagine what sort of shock is necessary, like what else is gonna, could be pushed through. There's obviously a tremendous amount of devastation, but what are some of the other things you think might be on sort of, they might be getting big eyes for in terms of what is left to sort of push in Texas that they haven't already?
Yeah, I think sort of vulture capitalists are some of the most creative people on the planet. We might not know for what all they have their eyes on. Like in Katrina, the big story obviously was charter schools and kind of completely privatizing the education system there. So you could see that. There were people sort of interned by private security forces in the aftermath of Katrina and disappeared for months. So that wasn't. I don't know how much that has kind of played into the long-term political geography of New Orleans, but those things certainly have long-standing impacts on the way communities are structured. And I this isn't my total area of expertise, but you have all of these neighborhoods in New Orleans being kind of rebranded and used as an excuse to push through a lot of gentrification in areas that were impacted by the storm, and rebuilding, of course, in floodplains where arguably there should maybe be development and should support people actually to move to other neighborhoods. But yeah, I think we don't quite know. But I've never underestimate how creative some of the worst people in this country are.
Well, speaking of living in disaster zones, I want to turn to Christian for a minute to ask you a few questions. Christian Parenti is a journalist, as people know. He wrote the book Tropic of Chaos and writes a lot on the environment. Also wrote one of my favorite books, which is published by Verso, Lockdown America. Fantastic book. People should check those out. that's on the rise of militarized policing and incarceration. But you wrote an article for us about, about New York City. We're coming up on 5 years since Hurricane Sandy hit New York City. I guess I want to ask you a couple questions about what you're writing, because I think it's important and relevant given what Kate just said. Will New York City be ready if another storm hits?
No, it doesn't seem like it. Yeah, the article is not just about New York City. It's about it proposes that one of the early effects of climate change will be a kind of new urban crisis. With neoliberalism and gentrification, capital has returned to the city after leaving the cities for decades. Ending after World War II with the construction of the highways and the subsidies for suburbanization. Right, the urban crisis dominated the 70s. Now the idea of the urban crisis returning to these winning coastal cities seems really preposterous. But what I argued in the piece is that that's probably going to be one of the early effects of this. And the way it would happen is through just successive inundations and a rotting out of the infrastructure. And at a certain point, there's going to be some sort of crisis in confidence, and there will be an evacuation by capital and by people, and a collapse in property values. And who knows, what the repercussions of that could be for the larger financial system, because so much of debt is collateralized with real estate. So that's what I was looking at, and it doesn't seem like any city is particularly ready for this. We have the example of a wall that's being built on Manhattan, but at the same time, de Blasio is building a trolley on the Brooklyn waterfront. So the level of denial is really intense, and the level of the denial is to some extent rational, because everyone, in the short term at least, because everyone is hostage to property values. If you were a mayor and you wanted to get some money to invest in adaptation for your city, it would be very dangerous if you went around and said, hey, we're going to be inundated, we need money, we need to raise property taxes. People would start getting hip to this and selling short. And then, what happens to the tax base of the city? So there's this really weird thing where, like, homeowners all are in on this, right? If you own a home, you're not going to be like, wow, my house is going to be flooded in 20 years, I hope I can sell in time. No, you live in denial about that or quietly get out. There's evidence of sort of in Miami that altitude is becoming a new factor in gentrification. People are evacuating because there's so much sunshine flooding. So that's the situation. I mean, I don't really see elites snapping out of it unless there is some sort of coordination, possibly laterally by different city governments and state governments, the way we're seeing around climate change, but states taking action in lieu of federal action. But
yeah, I thought it was really interesting the way that you sort of talked about the specific strategies that are being implemented and how those will fall short. One thing there's in the news also the past couple of days has been sort of like, or at least on left media or whatever, is people sort of exposing Ted Cruz and other people for asking for money for Texas when they were so slow to give money to New York, or they were trying to fight it or whatever. And it was notable that in the wake of Hurricane Sandy, there was the Congress was so slow to act that it was just held up at every level, which is obviously like super shitty. But it's the argument you're making is also that it's sort of short-sighted, right? That the coastal cities play a particular role in the national economy. Can you talk about that?
Global economy. Yeah, I mean, coastal cities are crucial connective points for the global economy. They're also choke points for resources, the airports, the ports, the pipelines. And I quote in the piece a study by Chatham House, and they have numbers like 55% of all world grain goes through 14 specific choke points. And you start realizing that the whole world economy has these places of real vulnerability, and coastal cities are those. And of course, this could be dealt with if we acknowledge it now and had some planning, but that would require acknowledging the reality of state power. It would require the left to really get more focused on pressuring the state to do what it actually does anyway, and we live in total denial about, which is that the capitalist state plans constantly, consistently. It plans, it shapes the economy, it subsidizes, it penalizes, it absolutely guides the economy, and you cannot go through the economic history of capitalism and find anywhere an example of a national economy industrializing without essentially a developmentalist state guiding it, whether or not that state calls itself a developmentalist state. So, that reality gives me some hope that the state does guide things. And so what we have to do is acknowledge that. I think we also have to acknowledge that we are an environment-making species. Too often on the left, among environmentalists, there's a kind of like misanthropic self-hatred, that people are bad, nature this other thing, garden. And if that's the case, and we're the intruders, if that's the case, right, the implications are be the change you want to see and commit suicide. But that also doesn't comport with actual environmental history. Human beings have had very beneficial effects on the environment in certain situations, not because they tread lightly, but frequently because they are very engaged. So the Northeast, for example, was burnt twice a year by Native Americans. The way that Native Americans sort of managed their resources was to light the landscape on fire during the wet season and create edge habitat and then harvest deer. And we're now, it's only been the last 20 years that environmental historians are realizing, like, oh, wow, a lot of these grasslands around the world are produced by, in part by human fire. And this, in effect, increases biodiversity, increases life. So the point of that just being that human beings are environment makers, all species are, right? Nature is really nothing except a series of organism-environment interactions where every organism is part of some other organism's environment. Beavers need beaver ponds. They don't find them, they make them. And so that's what we do. And we have to accept that and take responsibility for consciously making this climate, because we're unconsciously making it. And we actually have the technology, we have the money, and we have actually even the laws already on the books to start moving in the right direction.
Mm-hmm. So that's actually a perfect transition to bring Peter into the discussion. So Peter Frase is on the Jacobin editorial board. He also wrote Four Futures, Life After Capitalism, which is for sale on the table here. So Pete, you think a lot about technology. You wrote this great piece on geoengineering, which I thought was really useful. You argue the left should have an engagement with this technology in sort of the ways that Christian is suggesting. I guess first I want to back up for a second. Can you talk why the left has typically tended to regard geoengineering with great suspicion, if not just outright hostility?
Well, I can give at least a couple of reasons. One is that it's regarded, when people start talking about, people, geoengineering means this whole range of things, basically large-scale manipulation of the environment and the climate. And, one of the things I try to argue in this piece is that, as Christian said, we are an environment-making species and have been for a long time. But I think in a lot of sort of green left discourse, there's a tendency to fall back on this notion that there is this separation between humanity and nature. And even among people who on some level understand our deep implication in the manipulation of the natural world, there's also a tendency to fall back on, there's a lot of these metaphors, but the one I always keep coming back to is reducing the carbon footprint. What does that imply? It implies that the problem is we're stepping too heavily, and we step a little more lightly, then nature will provide. Nature will heal itself. But it doesn't work that way, because we can't reduce the carbon footprint because we're already up to our necks. And so part of it is that reluctance to understand the deep implication, that will persist. And this is the thing, that will persist after a capitalist civilization hopefully passes from this earth before it kills all of us, right? And it's like you were mentioning this whole idea of capitalism is destroying the climate. Yes, of course it is. But that damage is still there after capitalism is gone. And so we need a politics that has something to say about that, has something to say about what the socialist project of reconstruction is, which is, yes, of course, getting off of carbon, energy, and fossil fuels, but is also about remediation. Christian talks more in what he wrote for the issue about carbon sequestration. I talk a little bit about some more, out there ideas like spraying particles into the stratosphere, and I don't think that the actual particulars of these proposals are necessarily the issue. What is the issue is the other thing, which is that whenever you bring this stuff up, people give you a response that's sort of like, well, can't we just leave this for after the revolution? Like, isn't it dangerous to even suggest it because it distracts people from the need to get off of fossil fuels? Whereas my response would be, that's precisely why we need to talk about it, because, to use the old cliche, you may not be interested in geoengineering, but geoengineering is interested in you. There are people out there, both from the capitalist private sector, from state actors, from various of these sort of bodies of NGOs and transnational organizations that are already talking about this stuff and will be implementing it. And so that's why we need to be thinking and talking about it too.
Mm-hmm. So, I think that there's a pretty significant set of implications for the left, right? Especially the far left, that we're not talking about postponing, discussion of this till after the revolution. Like, the idea that capitalism is killing the planet is an important starting point, but if we stay there, it's sort of like, well, we need to get rid of capitalism, then we can worry about the environment. But it sounds like, what's being suggested here is that there are things that we can do in the here and now. There are reforms that we can, win and fight for and build a left to fight for that are worth fighting for on their own terms, that will actually do some good. Can you, I think it would be useful, because I just find that outside of specialties, people who are environmental specialists, they just don't hear some of these ideas very often. I'm wondering if you can suggest a few of these that the left could take up.
Yeah, and so, for example, as a sort of jumping off point, Christian mentioned this idea of like building the walls around Manhattan and all this stuff, which I agree, the way that it's being talked about is kind of bullshit. But in another sense, I do think people have to recognize, I guess the way I put it is, we're all Houston and we're all Amsterdam right now. So Houston, I don't know, I remember when Houston used to be used by libertarians and even by what I would call kind of left neoliberals as this example of this utopia of no regulation, specifically with regard to like zoning laws and, local property development regulation, and you didn't have, get the NIMBYs out of the way and let the market do its thing. And, and then you can, if you're on the left side of this, you can say progressive taxation on the back end, and that's all good. And we're seeing now the results of that. Kate has been writing about this, about the building over the wetlands, and, this like the consequence of the short-term, uncontrolled development in Houston is now this disaster. On the other hand, you can look at, Amsterdam, is the other classic example of this. And, I don't want to romanticize either Amsterdam in particular or Western European social democracy in general, because I think that's always a great risk. But there's a place you can go in Amsterdam where there is a public display. It's this giant plastic column that will show you at any given time of the day what the water level is based on the tide. And at many times, it will show you that most of Amsterdam, absent human intervention, would be underwater. And, after Hurricane Sandy, there were a lot of stories coming out about, people talking to Dutch engineers about what they did to basically make it possible for people to live in this place where otherwise it should not be possible for people to live because it should be underwater. And that's the question we're facing, is how to be a better, more socialist version of Amsterdam, or else be Houston.
So Alyssa, I just want to turn to you. Alyssa Battistoni is on the editorial board also of Jacobin and put together this issue, so thanks for putting together such an important and great issue. So your piece, so you have the editorial and a separate article, and the article takes up sort of the $1 million question, which is, how do we merge ecological concerns with working class movements, right? So like we're socialists, we understand that capitalism is killing the planet, we understand that we all have a common enemy, but it's not always quite clear how to merge these two. Oftentimes it's sort of that, the argument is made that workers need to learn how to do it less or need to accept job law. There's all these ways in which ecological concerns are counterposed. And so, we obviously want to do the opposite of that. We want to start merging these. Your article laid out a number of ways in which we could start merging them. Can you lay out a few of those?
Yeah. The jobs and environment question is kind of the recurring question of environmental politics in general, and the one that I think has been difficult for the left in particular because of a commitment to working class politics and workers' politics. And so I'm trying to think through the ways that that's happened and how to get past this divide, which is I think really just serves to have jobs versus the environment is a division that serves the interests of capital, which pits the critics of capitalist exploitation and degradation against one another. It creates, instead of having coalitions of people fighting, you end up having these sorts of setting people against each other. And so I think that's something we obviously want to overcome, to move past. But it's been difficult, and I think when when people are in need of jobs, when people are struggling to find work, it's very easy for corporations to come in and say, well, we're doing this development project and it'll create a bunch of jobs, so anyone who tries to stop it is just anti-worker. And that's just been this recurring thing for a long time. We've seen it a lot around the pipeline struggles that have happened in the past several years, and it's obviously sort of I think often when people talk about climate change and as it pertains to labor issues, you always have the sort of the coal miner in West Virginia, and that's sort of the figure of labor climate politics. And so what I think, or what I'm arguing we need to do is to is to be thinking about work in a different way, and how that relates to climate politics and to environmental politics, and to not sort of, I think, just fixate on, really, I think energy workers of all kinds as the only kinds of workers who have any kind of relationship to environment, because, whether it's, the sort of endless pieces on the dwindling of coal miners, who should be provided for regardless of what we do with coal, and who should not have to go and get, risk black lung disease for increasingly low wages. But, or the alternative is the green jobs, so you have solar installation or solar panel building or Tesla or whatever. And so I think we're really fixated on these. This is the only kind of dimension of what a green job would be. We should be thinking much more broadly, in my opinion, in general about climate change, and especially on the left. And, I think there are many ways, and climate change is a problem that goes, that really extends into many, many aspects of life. And so we need to be looking for it everywhere. And, I think that really where we, a lot of the work of, that we will need in a future that can, where the needs of workers and the environment can go together. The kinds of green jobs I think we need to have many, many more of are jobs that are often now called pink jobs or pink-collar jobs rather than traditional blue-collar jobs. And so that's the work of social reproduction and the kinds of work that I think are about making our lives better without necessarily using as many resources. And so that's teaching, nursing, care work, kinds of work that are usually done by women, people of color, and immigrants, and that are also the work that the majority of the working class today do. So the way forward for the left, I think, is to organize those kinds of workers regardless of, I think, no matter what. But I think there are also ways to organize that kind of work that are thinking about how the work of social and ecological reproduction that has always been or tends to be put off to the side, undervalued, underpaid, underrecognized, should be really, I think, central to what we're fighting for in the future. And I think that's really just like a place where we should be making that argument that, that organizing, people doing care work and people doing, education work and nursing and all these kinds of things are actually on the forefront of the labor climate movement, and to figure out ways to, build interesting new coalitions around that. And then I think the other place to look is thinking about, that a lot of the working class struggles do not have to be confined to the workplace, and so the ways that environmental the effects of, what are called environmental bads, so whether it's toxic waste or pollution or flooding, tend to be dumped on communities of color and working class communities. And this has been the entire environmental justice movement, trying to, bring attention to those things and to fight on environmental issues as sort of the broader, the workplace that spills out of the factory or out of the workplace, and fight on those sorts of things. And then alongside that, movements around making, a livable world, or a low-carbon world, a livable world. So whether that's public transportation, affordable housing in cities where you can get around on the bus or whatever it may be. So I think there are a lot of components to it, but trying to take a really broader picture is essential to all of it.
One of the things I really liked about the piece was, your insistence that, so as socialists, we have to obviously explain what's wrong with capitalism, but we also have to describe the world we're sort of trying to fight for. And so that's not just sort of like one where we have, livable wages, but that's a livable planet entirely. And so these things sort of merge together. What's interesting is that, it's a very exciting picture that you paint in the article. It's also the case, that it's a difficult thing when we're talking about trying to organize people who, like mine workers, for instance, who are, if the mining company goes away, the jobs evaporate, and so how do we manufacture new jobs, right? So what your article is saying is that we're not just trying to tell workers anything that they want to hear in order to sort of win them to our side, right? We're trying to actually convince them of a program, right? We want to actually merge these in a way that has some sort of solidarity built into it in a long-term sense, right? It's not a short-term scam. Can you talk a little bit more about, like, so what do we? I mean, not that everybody at this event is going to go out to a coal mine, right, and start talking to a miner about, what they should do. But I think it's such an important thing because we don't often talk about concrete strategies for the left. What is it that, can you just reiterate some of your arguments about what is it that we should be saying to workers who are looking at losing jobs if sort of at least the liberal environmental wing, has its way and wins, right? If mines close, like how do we start merging these interests in a more fundamental way?
Well, again, I guess I think some of the point isn't that we should, it's to I think there are things we should make sure that we're doing to, provide for miners and so on. But I think the point is to not just be going out and thinking that organizing around climate and labor is organizing the mine workers. I think it's like thinking about that much more broadly. I do think that the left is going to have to be much more creative in terms of thinking about the future of organizing, and because I think even a lot of the kinds of work I'm talking about, I think there are many kinds of like work and social reproduction that is not inherently low carbon or environmentally friendly or whatever it may be. And so I think that is both a challenge and the sort of thing where you have interesting potential new coalitions. So, I don't know, things like unionized hotel workers alongside public transit advocates and unionized public transit workers. Like there are a lot of different places to start thinking about how to build into both, the movements that are made up of both the people who are, doing the work of like daily life, but also the people who are living their daily lives and want to be able to do that in a reasonably, a way that is, less onerous, more pleasurable, and more possible. And so I think, I think there are actually going to be real challenges. I don't think that the argument is quite that like all good things it'll just be sort of straightforward, and everything will unfold and like there will be no difficult like challenges. But I do think it's very important for the left to face those if we're not going to sort of just like continue to relitigate the like jobs versus environment or the like kind of environmentalism is just back to nature versus like high-tech capitalist modernity. And there are a lot of kinds of life that are not just aspiring after capitalist modernity.
So, so I'd love to go around again, maybe see if anybody has any responses to what was already said. I don't know if going in order puts people on the spot too much. Kate, do you have anything that you wanted to sort of respond to?
Oh, yeah. I mean, not too much. I mean, I think one thing that didn't didn't come up, which feels a little bit important to talk about, is just, how big this problem is. How this is the end of the world. That's not an overstatement. Like, what we're talking about is human civilization undergoing massive changes and the Earth potentially being unhospitable to human civilization. Like, that's the sort of stakes of all of this. And I think, we talk about the kind of faults of the environmental movement, which there are many. And I think there are also, that's real, and I think that's something to be talked about. But I think there's also this huge blind spot on the left for just how deeply the ecological crisis really has to inform how we do our politics. And it's not, I think the climate for a while has been treated as sort of one number on kind of a laundry list of issues that we care about, right? So, you look at these kind of like manifestos or policy positions that come out, and it'll be like number 7 or something out of like 15. There's an extent to which everything we care about as leftists is connected. That's true. You can't sort of de-link issues in the way that I think kind of nonprofit structures and politics have kind of encouraged us to do. But there is something really deep about climate change that really informs kind of how we have to think about our political project as people interested in seeing a better society and seeing a society where people can actually exist, let alone in ways that are more egalitarian, in ways that are more sort of just. So, I think, I come out of the climate movement, and I think there's this real sort of struggle between telling kind of environmentalists to start caring about people, to start thinking about these things in human terms, and then telling leftists to sort of care about the climate, and not, as a sort of, you should care about this thing, but that it really does sort of fundamentally alter the way you have to think about politics in the 21st century, when it really is unavoidable that where we're sitting right now could well be underwater in the next 20 or 30 years, well within the lifetimes of many of us in this room. And so I think that has to change the way we talk about everything. I mean, it's, Naomi Klein obviously says this changes everything, and it really does. I think that is a challenge in some ways. I think it's also an opportunity, in part because there really is no way to solve this crisis. And not that we're going to solve it in this sort of total sense, we don't have to worry about climate change, and the world's going to stay exactly as it is once we reach this threshold and cross this thing. The world is going to be irrevocably changed already based on the changes that we've already kind of locked into place with carbon emissions. It's doing this in really an honest way and thinking earnestly about the crisis at hand requires really upending who holds power in our economy. And I think that's why some people on the right actually get this very correct when they talk about climate change as being this socialist plot. They talk about environmentalists as being watermelons who have this red sort of beating center. And if you are serious about this, that's kind of true. You do need more collective ownership. Fossil fuel companies should not exist. And in the process of sort of fighting for those things, for something like nationalization of the fossil fuel industry, for massive public transit, for a greater public sphere which can respond to storms, which can build actually storm resilient things in cities which will have higher sea levels. You set precedents in that process which make society better. So it's not as if we need to think about climate policy on the one hand and sort of economic policy on the other. Those things are the same, especially in the 21st century, which is rapidly undergoing changes. And we'll see more events like Harvey. But really, it's, we're not going to get, it's not like there's going to be a Harvey every day necessarily, which forces people to think about this. These changes are much slower. This is a much more gradual process. And I think anyone really recognizes there's no point at which we're going to say, oh, wow, we're in the shit. That will happen over the course of time. And, if you were to fast forward 20 years from now, you might say, wow, New York looks very different. Living through that will be a very different process. And I think actually, understanding what that process looks like and doing that sort of on our own terms is hard work. Because we can't, it's as humans, it's very hard to think about this problem because it's existential in some way. So, yeah, I mean, I think just really taking seriously how this has to change our understanding of political economy in a much bigger way than just sort of understanding climate as its own, sort of issue area.
Yeah, so a couple things that came to mind when listening to people's comments. I think it's something I mentioned in the article, right? We have this slogan, no techno fix, which easily slides into no technology will not be part of the solution. And that really should not be the way we read that. A techno fix means like only technology without also dealing with social relations, right? So, okay, yeah, there can't be a techno fix. We don't want that. But actually technology is very important. And one of the most important ones, I think, is this new thing called enhanced weatherization. In Iceland, they have been able to turn CO2 gas into essentially soft limestone within 2 years. And you basically mix sulfuric acid and CO2 in water and press it down. There's probably other scientific stuff that goes on. And you press it down into basalt rock formations, and it precipitates into limestone, essentially. And this was theoretically understood several years ago, and they thought it would maybe take like 10 or 20 years. So they've shown that we can actually store this stuff safely. We have the ability to strip CO2 out of the atmosphere at a phenomenally fast rate. But, there's no way to make a profit off this. And if you read the booster literature about this enhanced weatherization, people are talking about how and they can sell the limestone to builders, which is like ridiculous. Why would you buy artificial, low-quality limestone when there's cheap limestone? This is ridiculous, right? Obviously, this is a utility. This cannot be, the commodity form cannot deliver this. So I think that's a key distinction. No techno-fix is not the same as no technology. In terms of the socialism thing, let's remember, socialism is not the same as decarbonization. There is, I think, a tendency on the left, because we had such a history of intense anti-communism in this country, we don't look much at the history of what was called actually existing socialism. Nor do we necessarily look in a critical fashion at what's going on in Bolivia and other places like that. I mean, there's critique, but there are numerous examples of socialist experiments, regardless of what you think of Evo Morales or Hugo Chavez or the Soviet Union. A lot of capitalists didn't like the Soviet Union, don't like Evo Morales, didn't like Hugo Chavez. And there was significant redistribution of wealth. There's all sorts of other problems. But there wasn't any kind of automatic decarbonization that flowed from that. So decarbonization is its own thing that actually has to be pursued as such. It is not a natural byproduct of socialism. And I say that as a socialist. Alyssa's comments about the struggle around reproduction, I think that's really very important. And in a way, climate change attacks precisely the sites of reproduction, right? The home, the hospital, neighborhoods. And these are sites of reproduction in the sense that this is where labor power, which is the source of value, is produced, and then before it's delivered to capital. And also, this is a site where surplus value is extracted from the working class in the form of rents. So these storms kind of inherently politicize these spaces. And what happened in Katrina was privatization, deeper commodification of these sites of reproduction. We could also push back and push, in the name of kind of crisis and storm socialism, if you will, push back against commodification. And you can see the sort of the potentially reactionary, repressive aspects of storm, but also the potentially very kind of subversive, radical assertion of collective being. And I mean, Rebecca Solnit writes about that in her book. I forget what it's called, but yes. So, we could be pushing for, if we had a left that could be pushing in the same fashion for, in a fashion we're not doing, but like attacking the same sites that capital attacks, the public school system, right? Housing, healthcare for the young and for the old. If we could push to decommodify this. And the reason that storms could be potentially kind of progressive is that what is aid? When you go to people's rescue, right? I mean, no one's being charged for that. That's like human beings helping each other. And there's something inherently redistributive about it, right? And you realize there's a slippery slope. It's like, well, these people have been displaced from their homes. They deserve a free place to live. They deserve free health care. Oh, really? For how long? And how many people? And whoa, and let's go with this. Like maybe actually, some of these services that you purchase should be decommodified. Maybe healthcare should just be something you get and your tax money pays for, right? I mean, so these openings actually exist in these moments of crises.
Well, I was first say it's wonderful and intimidating to be on the panel with the other people here who all know more about the specific intersections of climate and ecology and capitalism than I do, and half of what I know I probably learned from them. I do want to get at a particular thing, not to pick on Kate, but it was a particular line that I think kind of gets to something that always kind of sticks in my craw, this idea of this question of this is the end of the world. And part of what I'm trying to get at and what I'm trying to argue is it's not. It's not in the sense of, as I go into in the article, in the issue, nature is indifferent to us. Whether we're here or not is, I don't take the religious view that God created this world for us, so it can be a world of cockroaches and it doesn't matter to nature. But it also is in the sense that capitalism also is indifferent to us. The capital relation, as I view it, is simply the means of taking money and, by some means, turning it into more money. And for the agents of that process, that can happen through providing people's basic necessities. It can happen through, doing horrible things. It can happen through getting people to click hate reads on BuzzFeed articles, or it can happen through cleaning up the aftermath of, climate change-related destruction. And until the last capitalist pays the last other human on Earth to cut up people for meat to eat, capitalism persists. And so I think it's important to understand that and to confront it. Because I think there's one of the things that tends to happen in some of these discourses is this sense of like, oh, this is it. This apocalyptic kind of rhetoric. It's like, oh, this is it. Now capitalism's finally done it. It's undermined the conditions of its own existence, and we might not get socialism, we might not survive, but this is it. And it's not. I mean, capitalism profits off misery and it profits off happiness. It's a form. It's a formal relation. And that's I think, and understanding that I think is one of the important things about understanding just exactly what a difficult problem we face in trying to both get past capitalism and deal with the ecological crisis, which I agree with Christian are separate things in some way, are distinct things.
Distinct, yeah.
Related, but distinct. So that's all I'd say.
Well, there's a lot to say. So, I mean, I guess, to take up this point, separate but distinct, but, mutually imbricated, and we live in a world built by capitalism and climate change is a part of that. And I think we also live in a world where a lot of left responses to left politics or movements have been responding to capitalism in different moments. And I think that one of the things that's very important about, not just kind of, building a kind of socialism that is not attentive to, or that's, that's not decarbonized or any of these things, is recognizing the moment we're in and the ways in which, yes, this world has been shaped by capitalism. By humans, but specifically certain kinds of human activity, but trying to really change the way we think about what socialism we want to build and what kinds of movements could build it. So I think we do need to be very, clear about that. And this is sort of what I guess take your point, Kate, to mean about like this is. How extensive this is, and it's the end of the world. I mean, not necessarily because like it'll just be, all right, capitalism is now going to crumble and like it's all over, or something just completely apocalyptic. Although I think we should not underestimate the effects of climate change at all, and need to be thinking about it much more seriously than we have. But I think just the sense of people pay attention to climate change when there's when there's a storm, when there's a disaster, and when we turn to it. But we really need to be looking and seeing climate everywhere, whether that's in not just sort of in the aftermath of the disaster, in the photos coming out of Houston, or in the Ninth Ward after Katrina, but in the things that existed before that, and the kinds of projects to rebuild cities, to live in the world that go on every day, and it is going to be in daily life. And I think that's it's daunting, but I think there's a lot of potential there, and we really, I think the things that the left has been. As we've seen some, tentative signs of resurgence and left political programs winning in places, it is on things like, people being able to afford to live where they want to live, people wanting to be able to afford their medical care, being able to afford the, to live in this world. And so I think that, a politics that is oriented around, the world we live in, and expanding that to think about, the social dimension of that, but also the world itself and how we can be, building a livable world on the kinds of extending the kind of thinking about social reproduction and care to ecological reproduction, to the planet, to the kinds of work that, as Peter and Christian have said, we are, humans are changing. It's not sort of humans in nature, we're always changing the environment, but so how can we do that with care and with recognition that we need to keep living here? And I think that there's a lot of really, I think there's a lot of exciting potential there. It's also going to be extremely daunting, so, but I guess, I think in many ways my closing sort of the thing I really feel we should just keep in mind is that socialism and decarbonization don't necessarily go together, but I don't think that we can think of a 21st century socialism that is not eco-socialism, and for that matter, eco-feminist socialism and eco-feminist anti-racist socialism, because otherwise we are going to live in a really fucked up and terrible world. So.
Yeah, so I want to give, so there's a couple things that came out, and I definitely want to give people on the panel a chance to respond to that, and I want to create as much space for discussion as possible. So I just have one more quick question, and then we'll give everybody a chance to come back again at the end and to address whatever they want to. Because there's another theme, like you said, that, you listed off a number of things that socialism has to be, one of which was anti-racist, and there was a number of themes, this kept coming up throughout the issue in ways that it just kept sticking out to me. Like one, Christian, you were talking about that the sorts of migration that are caused by ecological disaster, and this, which are creating these racist responses, one of which we see a lot in Europe, Trump is taking advantage of, which is that all these immigrants are soaking up all of our social welfare or whatever we need. So there's a real response to this sort of stuff that's quite terrifying, and as we see this happening more and more, we can imagine this going to another level, especially with the sort of immigration stuff in Texas that you're raising, et cetera. So, when I think about the left the environmental movement that existed, through the 80s and 90s, for many decades, if not centuries, I think about an environmental movement that was totally incapable of actually addressing this stuff. You talk about this, there's a piece on the Sierra Club, dabbling with eugenics, going through all sorts of, terrible, terrible twists and turns when they take the sort of a seemingly innocuous comment, like we're taking up too much of the planet, there's too many people, we need to limit birth, all these things get taken to terrible conclusions. So I guess I want, and then your piece is talking about how we need to be starting to identify key areas in which will not only help us build an environmental movement, but are also populated largely by people of color, as workers, et cetera. So I guess I wonder, when we think about bridging ecological concerns with working class concerns, it's not just, it's easy to think about, the mainstream conception of working class is a white person in overalls going to work in a factory or in a mine or whatever. Obviously, it's much, much more diverse than that. Do we see promise? I guess I'm wondering what people think about, are there things that have been particularly exciting recently, trends in sort of bringing the environmental movement to merge with not workers' movements on an anti-racist basis? Are there still steps specifically that need to be taken? How do we sort of think about this going forward?
I can start on that. I mean, I think one thing, just like before answering that question, to sort of contextualize, like there's always been sort of different strains of the climate and environmental movement. So the one strain which I think gets talked about and sort of rightly derided is largely white kind of mainstream environmentalism, which emerged sort of in the, in some of the same organizations that in the 1970s were pushing lawsuits that created things like the Clean Water Act and the Clean Air Act. These sort of activist lawyers that over time sort of ossified into these really sort of massive institutions, things like the Environmental Defense Fund, the NRDC in some ways, though they do some really positive work, but have become these things which are almost, some of these organizations are totally divorced from the concerns of working people, and have like this really sort of bizarre way of thinking about climate change. And you see that in people like Al Gore, people like Elon Musk, who get sort of Michael Bloomberg, of all people, gets sort of lifted up as these sort of environmental heroes. So that comes out of that tradition. And then there's been this other tradition of working class people, whether talking about the environment and climate or not, who are low carbon protagonists in this way. So, that's everything from the folks I was talking about in Houston who have been fighting refineries in their communities for a while. It's people like organizations in places like Chester, Pennsylvania, who are fighting the fact that all of the trash from the Upper West Side comes to their neighborhood in suburban Pennsylvania. And those struggles have been happening for a long time. And then there are like housing activists who are fighting for a type of urban life which is objectively more low carbon, dense, affordable housing. So I think it's just important to sort of name terms when we talk about the climate movement, just because it is such this vast thing that I think gets, there's this sort of public face of it, and then all of these other people who are implicated in it, and have been pushing good things. And in terms of things that are hopeful, I think it comes out of this sort of other tradition that is not the mainstream environmental movement, but has really pushed and influenced the way those spaces operate, namely coming out of places like the fight against the Keystone XL pipeline, the Dakota Access Pipeline. And I think there's a way that these sort of anti-infrastructure fights get talked about, which I think is a little frustrating, saying like if we stop these pieces of infrastructure, we'll stop climate change for some reason. Like there's a sort of logical jump that doesn't quite make sense. I think what's been really exciting about these fights is that the moral terms of the debate are so clear when you look at something like the Dakota Access Pipeline fight or Keystone, and that you have like a multinational corporation literally trying to destroy the community of people who are really just fighting for water, or fighting for these basic things that we think are so sort of basic to human life, and that's hard to argue with. It's really hard to argue that no, you shouldn't have clean drinking water because I want to ship oil to the Gulf of Mexico for export, so I can make more money. So I think that those sets of struggle are really exciting, and I've seen are sort of slowly starting to change the way these mainstream environmental spaces operate. And I think the other thing, just briefly, is this real kind of excitement about these really like unsexy issues of governance, especially since the election, people contesting for sort of local offices, thinking about like what running for mayor, but also things like comptroller and like public service commissions, these really kind of like semi-arcane bodies which we don't really think about, but that are starting to become sites of political contestation, in part because they have this really direct link into extractive capitalism. So the Keystone XL pipeline right now is being held up by Nebraska's Public Service Commission, which is like a 5-member elected body in Nebraska, and could stop one of the biggest pipeline developers in the world. And so they're starting to think about, what does running people for this body look like? What does running people for rural electric cooperative boards look like? Those sorts of things, which are, deeply, deeply, deeply unsexy. It's like the most boring work you can imagine. These meetings are like think of your worst image of a bureaucracy and then just picture yourself in that position. But I think that's really what the work of climate has to look like. What does a socialist FEMA look like? What does a socialist Department of Housing and Urban Development look like? Those sorts of levels, which are not, it's not fun work necessarily to think about that, but I think, especially with climate, important.
I'm not sure that everyone thinks of white guys in blue overalls when they think of the working class. I mean, the country's gotten pretty diverse, and everybody's part of the working class practically. But be that as it may, a good example of how all these fights can come together, I think, is Richmond, California, where you had a refinery, Chevron refinery, versus the community. And this is class struggle at the site of reproduction, right? Why is it class struggle? It's class struggle because the community is getting poisoned by these fires and emissions from the refinery, and they're demanding that the refinery take money out of profits and put it into safety features. So it's fundamentally a struggle over who gets what. How much of the output of society goes to the private owners of capital, and how much of it goes to the well-being of people who are not making money off of it. That struggle culminates in Richmond, California. For those of you who don't know, is a historically African-American town in the North Bay Area. And that struggle eventually leads to a left-wing takeover of the city government. Not takeover, winning elections. And they're now, doing what they can as a progressive city council. So that, I think, is a really good example of, class struggle, dealing with environmental racism and climate change all at once. And just quickly, I do want to come to Kate's defense. I think we get too hung up on either the world is ending or performing our optimism of the will and our bravery in the face of science. And both are kind of silly, because I have news for you. You're all aware of this, but we seem to forget it. We're all going to die, right? Every individual dies. Also, the world will eventually end. Okay, the sun cools, and in about 1.5 billion years it expands and consumes the Earth. So this idea that all this is going to go on forever is wrong. It is going to end sometime, somehow. So what's the big deal, right? We already knew that. So I don't think we need to get fixated on either. But there is, what Jim Hansen said about the Venus syndrome is that the real worst case scenario of just unchecked climate change, where it becomes self-compounding, where you have the planet gets to the point where it's so hot that the oceans boil off and water in the atmosphere is a heat-trapping gas, and you have an environment like Venus. That in about 2,000 years, if we burn all the coal and all the oil, that is what the science indicates the Earth will be like. So it's a possibility. It's a real possibility, but whatever. And in terms of that question, I think Fidel Castro summed it up best. He said, if humanity had only 10 years left to live, we would still have to struggle. And what if society is going to collapse, which it will eventually? What if our social movement is a type of long-term hospice? Why should we let the rich have everything and treat people miserably and sick their police on them? It doesn't matter whether it goes on for a day or for 100 years, right? We got to oppose it and make our society better and more fair.
Well, we just went from Richmond, California, to the inevitability of the collapse of human civilization. I think all we were missing there was the inevitable heat death of the universe. But
now we have it.
No, I'm just going to take it back to the. I don't have a big picture, answer to offer here. So I'll give a different sort of aspect, from my own political work of ecology and class struggle, which is. I live in Newburgh, New York, in the Hudson Valley, about 60 miles north of here, where it's a deindustrialized, basically Rust Belt city of 30,000, mostly not white people, unemployment, poverty, crime, drug addiction, everything like that. One of the assets historically that we have had is that we had our own water source. We had our own reservoir owned by the city. Unfortunately, for the last year, we have not been able to use that water source because it was discovered that it was being polluted by toxic chemicals that were coming from the nearby Air Force base. And so, just the other day, I was at a meeting where we were discussing our political approach to this and what we need to do, and clearly what the big obstacle we're facing right now is that we need to try to force the Department of Defense, who are both the most powerful and deep-pocketed actor here, but also the one we have least leverage over, particularly given the current commander-in-chief, to do something here. And so we were talking about what do we want? Basically, if we're going to try to put some pressure on them, possibly by getting some more attention to this. If anyone in the room who happens to be an environmental reporter who might be able to get commissioned to write about this, I'd be happy to give you all the sources you need. What do we want out of them? And one thing that came up was, we need, there is an Army Corps of Engineers, and there's an actual larger issue of the watershed that feeds these water sources in the Hudson Valley that needs to be analyzed, that needs to be reconstructed. And this gets back to my point about this sort of like need for positive programs of ecological reconstruction. And so it's like, okay, let's start talking about that. And so this takes it all the way from poor people in Newburgh to the imperialism in the military-industrial complex. And it's also a way that we build solidarity and we build linkages across various divides of class and race that exist, in Newburgh as they do in New York City, in a way that I think actually advances and sort of an eco-socialist agenda while also forwarding many of the other sort of aspects of the front that we want to build. So that's my thought about it.
Yeah, I think like I guess I was just saying, but on the sort of initial question in terms of whether there's some opportunity here to bring together lots of different struggles, I think absolutely. And I think there are a lot of different versions of how anti-racist, feminist, and socialist struggles, I think, go together and can, and particularly with climate change. But one that I always think of or think has been a really useful model in the past few years has been in Canada, the LEAP Manifesto, which is a manifesto that was developed by a group of, or a sort of collective of environmental groups, labor unions, indigenous groups, and more general sort of activist organizations. And it's they developed a program that's around that puts forth these points around recognizing indigenous rights, caring for each other and the planet. That's like really trying to develop a program that is integrating not only like these different perspectives, but also based on the work that people have been doing in actual organizations. And I find that very exciting, and would love to see a version of that happening here in the U.S. I think I was struck by how many points of their program overlapped with the program put forth by the Movement for Black Lives in terms of things around, Kate was talking about environmental justice struggles and where people are, fighting against the kinds of impacts of whether it's of pollution or toxic development or whatever in their communities, but also things around environment or economic justice. And wanting jobs that are, jobs that are good for communities and for people. And so I think there's a lot of potential, or there are a lot of the elements of this kind of movement that already exist. And then I think, one of the things we haven't talked about as much here, but that I think is one of the really major challenges of climate politics is sort of the international element or the global planetary element, and that socialist politics, left politics have traditionally obviously been internationalist or aspired to internationalism, and then I think pulling that off is obviously very difficult for a lot of reasons, but I think more crucial than ever. And really, having connections to to people in the global south who are going to be bearing the brunt of climate change. I mean, there's been really massive flooding in India and Bangladesh these past few weeks. So, there's already many impacts of climate change hitting around the world. And so I think thinking about, how to, and Peter's piece talks about this some, but, that I think really like how we can build real internationalist movements is really crucial. While also doing the local work that both Kate and Peter are talking about and that Christian's piece talks about. And so doing it all, I guess, and on a very short timeline, because even though maybe one day the universe will collapse and, heat death will happen, we would like to preserve our planet for as long as we can in the meantime. So, but that will take, I think whether or not we have, the point where the timeline I think really does matter is that we do have a very short timeline to get politics moving. We have to do a lot very fast. It's very daunting, but the only way there's no way around that. So I think we need to just look at it head on and figure out what to do.
All right, on that note, we're going to kick it open to discussion. I'm going to let the folks at home go because, as I mentioned earlier, but maybe we could just thank the speakers really quickly for great discussion.